Bitcoin continues to print new all-time highs when priced in the melting ice cubes that are fiat currencies. And during these times when the bull run is really getting started, it's easy for us to feel like we're winning. And make no mistake, when people talk about the inevitability of Bitcoin, I think there is a degree of truth in that when it comes to number go up. But is Bitcoin inevitable when it comes to being able to facilitate billions of people using the network in a self-custodial fashion, paying and transferring value in a truly peer-to-peer fashion? I think that is far from inevitable. It's pretty clear that Bitcoin needs to continue to change in order to enable billions around the world to use Bitcoin in a self-custodial fashion. Otherwise, are we condemning Bitcoin to be just another one of those financial products on the shelves of these mega institutions? And is the majority of people destined to use Bitcoin in a custodial way? So that's what's at stake here. And while I and many can sympathize with the calls for ossification, i.e. no more changes to Bitcoin, there is a huge risk, if that happens, of Bitcoin failing to live up to its potential of this truly peer-to-peer monetary system. And so it begs the question, how might Bitcoin change? What even is the process to make changes to Bitcoin? What is Bitcoin consensus? What are the risks to change? What are the potential benefits? How does it actually work? Who has influence in this process? What can you be doing to participate and engage in this process? Today's video is going to break all of that down and pose the question, is there a looming crisis around Bitcoin consensus? Something that will no doubt impact all of us, regardless of the type of Bitcoin user we are. Let's jump in. I'm excited to share my company Joltz has partnered up with ThunderFunder to democratize investing in awesome Bitcoin startups. Now live on thunderfunder.com, where anyone can invest and own a real piece of Joltz. This video is made possible by Bitcoin trading cards, and I am pumped to have them as the first sponsor on my channel. I met Aladdin and the team back at Pacific Bitcoin 2022, and I'm not gonna lie, at the time I thought, okay, cool, a quirky little Bitcoin project, but little could I have imagined at the time how this project would capture imaginations. I've personally used these to orange pill people that I care about in my life. The art is stunning and features Bitcoin artists all around the world. You get high quality Bitcoin education on topics like economics and freedom as part of that, which makes this, as you can imagine, a really special project for me. And I'm not gonna lie, it makes you want to collect these. The community behind this is also truly insane. And I think they have a real shot at bringing Bitcoin to the mainstream. So if you're curious to check them out, head over to btc-tc.com where you can find the different series they've launched. And hey, if you do end up snagging some cards, you'll also get some Bitcoin rewards back on your purchase, powered by Joltz. Here's to ripping packs and stacking sats. So for a good portion of today's video, I'm going to be referencing the excellent work that was recently published. It is called Analyzing Bitcoin Consensus Risks in Protocol Upgrades. You can find this on GitHub. I will put a link in the description down below. And this comes as a collaboration between Lynn Alden, Steve Lee, Ren, CryptoFish, has been reviewed and kind of weighed in on by many others, but it's a really, really helpful document. And I'm going to kind of pull out a lot of the key nuggets and sort of overlay my own commentary, but I would definitely encourage you to check it out in its entirety. And the reason this is all timely, like going back to the price ripping and number go up technology, the more big money moves into Bitcoin, there's an argument that like the more they would want status quo. They don't want additional changes. And I think Saylor himself even has been fairly vocal about that, that like Bitcoin should ossify, right? Do not tamper with my number go up machine. Do not do anything that might disrupt that. And so as this big money comes in, I think there's a big risk of complete and total inaction. This also comes at a time when there's so many different proposals for change, whether it's CTV or CAT or vaults, all sorts of different proposals. In a near future video, I will likely go through some of the proposals that are a little more advanced in their kind of consensus building process. So be sure you're subscribed if you're not already. But let's break some of this down. Like, what is consensus in the first place? And by consensus, we're typically referring to the set of rules that define the validity of Bitcoin transactions and Bitcoin blocks, which are just bundles of transactions. And these rules are enforced by nodes or computers running the Bitcoin software. And as a node runner, you can run, old versions, new versions of Bitcoin Core. There are alternative clients or software that allow you to participate in Bitcoin. But ultimately, this consensus, this set of rules, ensures we all have a common understanding, a level footing, and that we can ultimately reach agreement on the state of the chain, on the ordering of transactions, on the history of transactions, etc. Crucial for a distributed, decentralized system. So examples of these rules could be around the size of blocks, right? How big can they be? How many transactions can they conceivably fit? It'd be about the structure of the transactions themselves. What are valid inputs and outputs? Are there additional conditions that I can put? What degree of programmability do I have? What can I do with Bitcoin's native scripting language? What can I not do? And so consensus is massively important, because if there is a lack of consensus, that can lead to a fragile state of the chain. It can lead to chain splits, where one group of people, one group of miners is building blocks according to a certain set of rules. Another group is building blocks according to another set of rules. You end up with a totally different and distinct token, and you get a lot of messiness. It is all very disruptive. And when we think about some of the wonderful traits of Bitcoin, its reliability, its security, its liveness, its ability to proceed and keep the chain moving forward, these are all critically important properties. And so I think my call to action for people is to at least be aware of this process and be aware of some of the ways that you can engage and participate in it. Because that is one of the trade-offs of self-sovereign money, right? You don't have to, but I think for those that do engage with this process, you will be a more informed, well-equipped citizen of Bitcoin. So let's now jump into these different categories of stakeholders that this paper very nicely, I think, outlines. And we'll go through them one by one and understand some of the incentives that drive each of these stakeholder groups, because those incentives are indeed why Lynn and the team have kind of bucketed these different stakeholders in the way that they have. So the first category they outline is economic nodes. And these are full nodes, but they're not necessarily you and I. These are typically going to be nodes that are receiving and sending significant amounts of Bitcoin payments. So, any crypto exchange or Bitcoin exchange is going to operate a node. So that is a good example of an economic node. You might have payment processors like OpenNode, for example. You'll have custody providers, maybe large merchants like a Bitrefill who accept Bitcoin as payment. All of these are good examples of economic nodes. And so these economic nodes have a good amount of power. And we'll look later on about how the level of influence of these different stakeholder groups can change across time within a particular upgrade proposal. But if you think about it, they have quite a lot of power. They could say, hey, even if miners positively signal for a change and that change gets activated, economic nodes could still choose to reject those blocks. As we will look at an example with the Segwit upgrade, they can also, if they're an exchange, for example, list or not list markets for the asset that results from a chain split or a fork. And again, we'll define that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. And so their incentives are, maximizing transaction volume, trading activity. They want the network to be secure and stable. They obviously have to comply with, certain regulatory requirements in their jurisdictions, etc. So that's economic nodes. The next group that I want to cover is miners. So I've done a lot of videos on this channel about Bitcoin mining, how it works, topics around decentralization when it comes to mining pool operators. So check out some of those videos if you are a little bit newer to Bitcoin. But suffice it to say that miners are basically running specialized hardware and competing for the ability to write the next block to the Bitcoin blockchain. In exchange for that service of settling transactions, they are receiving Bitcoin in the form of transaction fees, as well as, at least currently, the block subsidy as well. And so again, there's different stripes and flavors of miners. There's individual miners, there's large scale mining operations, there's mining pools. And so typically these miners, at least in historical upgrades, are able to signal their readiness. And this is a critical stage in the process of an upgrade. Once an upgrade has been kind of fully spec'd out, merged, even before that, heavily debated and discussed, miners are kind of the ones that are saying, okay, like, we want this or not. And they're able to signal that in the way in which they create their block templates attached to their blocks. And so they have a lot of powers, right? They can signal that readiness. They can create new blocks with new rules, potentially censor transactions if they don't abide by the rules that those miners agree with. And then if you think about the incentives for miners, right, they ultimately want to maximize their revenue. They also ideally want to avoid network instability. And that's why you've seen in past upgrades, for example, in the block size wars, a lot of miners were actually in favor of bigger blocks, as you would imagine, right? That could potentially lead to higher transaction fees, more revenue for miners. But when they ultimately saw that a lot of the economic nodes and a lot of even individuals at a more grassroots level, were advocating so fervently against that change, they sort of realized, hey, like, we would love to get a little bit of extra transaction revenue potentially, but not at the expense of creating, instability in the network. Then you have what Lynn and the group label as investors. And this is an interesting one. I think this group is certainly growing in its influence. They're not typically going to play a very day-to-day role in weighing in on particular proposals or advocating therein. But particularly as big money comes in, this is going to get interesting, right? So this could include large individual holders or whales of Bitcoin. It could be active and passive institutional funds. It could be sovereign wealth funds, central banks, governments. Think of all these giant holders that are gradually coming in. Think about how those types of entities could, for example, fund the development of alternative clients as opposed to Bitcoin Core. Bitcoin Core is used by probably 98, 99% of nodes on the network, but there are alternative clients. And so what if a big institutional fund, what if BlackRock comes along and funds the development of a particular alternative client that maybe has certain alternative rules and really kind of pushes and markets that? Again, I think there's a counter argument as to why they would not do that as well, but that introduces some very interesting dynamics too. And so the powers that this group can exert are, you can obviously influence market prices through buying and selling activity to the degree that there is a chain split and you sort of end up with a separate asset. So you have BTC and then, BCH, Bitcoin Cash, right? It's up to this investor group to sell one of those forks. Maybe they hold both of them, but they can express their beliefs about which is the sort of true chain by selling the asset that they don't want. Indeed, that is what happened with Bitcoin Cash, as well as Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, all these different things. And so again, as I was alluding to it from an incentive standpoint, yes, in some ways, maybe there's a threat here of, BlackRocks of the world coming and funding development for Bitcoin to go in a certain direction. But at the same time, right, they want to maximize the value of their holdings. They want to maximize the perceived stability and robustness of this network for selling more people on Bitcoin and making fees every time they buy. And we'll also discuss a perhaps more nefarious kind of angle on this in a little bit later in the video. But that's the investor bucket. So definitely an interesting group. Next up, we have media influencers. This could be the media itself. This could be thought leaders with large followings. This is pretty self-explanatory, right? They can shape narratives around different proposals, potentially make it seem like there's more or less support than there actually is for certain consensus changes. And again, those incentives are going to look a little bit different than each of these other stakeholder groups. They're going to want to generate engagement. They're going to want to, generate clicks and eyeballs. Maybe they have sponsors, right, who are also funding them to cover things in a certain way. So again, interesting, and while an obvious stakeholder group, maybe not one that we often think as much about. If you go back through the history of the block size wars, there were interesting examples on both sides of the argument of some of this sort of narrative shaping and trying to really push and influence people with information that maybe was not always fully 100% true. Next, we have protocol developers. So this is often interchangeable with what you'll hear as like core developers. These are individuals that are actually merging changes into the Bitcoin core or other implementation of Bitcoin. So on the one hand, you may think, wow, this is a group that has a lot of power in being able to potentially veto proposed changes because they say, look, I'm just not going to merge that upgrade in because for whatever ideological belief I may have, I don't think that's the right move for Bitcoin. But on the flip side, if let's say they do integrate a change that the rest of the community thinks is not a good upgrade for Bitcoin, nodes can choose to not run that latest version of the software. So there's always checks and balances with that. So we can see that outlined in their powers, right? Proposing and actually implementing code changes, maintaining the reference client, in this case, Bitcoin Core. Obviously, these are folks who have the most technical expertise and knowledge around Bitcoin. So their inputs even to the discussion process of different changes also matters immensely. Some of them position themselves more as sort of janitors, right? We're just maintaining this thing. We're not really exerting overt influence. But as we will discuss later in the video, I think that's also an area that's somewhat up for debate as well. And then the final group, and they've sort of lumped in like end users like you and I, application developers as well. They sort of lumped this into one bucket. I think you could probably break those out, but in essence, these are either, users that are using Bitcoin as a store of value, maybe using it for payments, developers, building payment solutions like Lightning, new wallets, et cetera stuff. And you can see that you got ordinals and runes and stuff in this same bucket. So I do think you could probably split this out because there are quite different incentives for these different groups. And depending on their use cases, their incentives are going to look a little bit different as well. And then, of course, for a particular protocol change proposal, these different stakeholder groups might have different, the author group here calls state of mind, right? Like I'm massively in favor and advocating for a particular change. I'm supportive of a change. I'm neutral on a change. I'm unaware of the change. I'm against an exchange, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the different stakeholder groups. Again, you could argue different ways of shuffling that around a little bit, but I think that does a nice job of capturing all the different groups. Now let's talk a little bit about how changes have been made in the past. What are the different mechanisms by which that has happened? So anytime we have a consensus change, it's either in the form of a soft or hard fork. A soft fork is going to be a backwards compatible change, meaning that for nodes that have not yet upgraded to the latest software, they're still going to see those new blocks, those new transactions, new blocks that are adhering to this, whatever new rule set. They're still going to see those as valid. And so this is nice, right? Only the nodes that want to have those new features or whatever new rules, they can upgrade, but others are not forced to. This is the ideal path, right? Because you don't have this contentious hard fork, which is not backwards compatible, where you are forcing all nodes to basically make a decision. Like, are you sticking with the old rules? Or are you going with the new rules? And then inevitably in a situation where you don't have universal consensus for one of those paths, you end up with a chain split where different parties are building on different chains that all come back to this same canonical version. But that's much tougher, right? It's much tougher to get the level of consensus needed. And particularly now that we have this more diverse set of stakeholders, that group of stakeholders has changed and evolved and grown more complex as time has gone forward. As you get more economic energy sucked into Bitcoin, presses incentives in different ways than it did in the historical past. Those are the two types of consensus changes in terms of whether they're backwards compatible or not. And then how they actually happen in practice is first with a whole lot of research, typically years of research, debate within the community, input from developers, both application developers who might benefit from a particular change, as well as from, protocol developers who might say, hey, is this really going to be, secure? Are we going to damage the security of Bitcoin in any sort of way? So typically all the things like CTV that, you'll see maybe posted in a headline on X or whatever, like chances are those different proposals have been debated and discussed and talked about for years. And let's say it's been fully spec'd out, all the code is there, it's been reviewed, thoroughly debated. Community basically agrees, hey, this is a good thing that we want. Bitcoin Core protocol developers then merge that into Bitcoin Core. And so then you have some sort of activation mechanism, right? Like, what is the path and process by which this actually now goes live? In the old days, you had something called Flag Day, which is super simple. It basically sets a future date and or block height and says, okay, the new rules automatically come into effect then, so upgrade in this window of time. Like, very simple, straightforward. As things got more complex over time, as you had more diverse different stakeholder groups, there was introduced the ability to signal readiness. So codified in BIP 34 as well as BIP 9. BIPs are Bitcoin improvement proposals, so changes themselves. By the way, not every change necessitates a soft or hard fork. There's actually changes that are published to Bitcoin periodically that might be as simple as enabling Bitcoin to run on the latest and greatest, hardware and machines and different things like that. But BIP 34 and BIP 9 introduced this ability for signaling readiness. So miners could, for example, increment the version in their block templates that they're attaching to the block. So basically how they're crafting the block, they can signal that, hey, yes, we support this change. And upon reaching a certain threshold of hash rate that is in support of this change, then the activation goes live. Now, as I described that, you may say, okay, that seems a little bit miner-centric. And so what then evolved further became BIP 8. And really what BIP 8 does is it adds an additional parameter to this activation process, which effectively seeks to disable miners from indefinitely vetoing a particular upgrade. So said another way, this user activated soft fork is a situation in which individuals running nodes can just reject blocks that are not signaling for a particular upgrade. Or similarly, a user rejected soft fork would be a situation in which individuals are rejecting blocks that do adhere to some new set of rules. So again, this interesting interplay. This is a very iterative, messy process. There is no solidified governance committee that says, all right, here's the rules and push them through. So really interesting how this happens. It's worth noting that the user activated soft fork concept, I don't think has been used in any particular Bitcoin Core upgrade, and certainly continues to be debated, right? Because there's this sort of tension between miners and users in the way in which that activation goes through. But a useful case study to tie all of this together is looking at some of the past protocol changes. The most recent two major upgrades were Taproot in 2021 and then Segwit in 2017 before that. And so as they outline in the paper here, Segwit was a really interesting example. You had a lot of contention, right? You had the protocol developers that did implement the Segwit code after a lot of debate and discussion. They merged it into Core. They also pointed out issues with alternative clients that were proposed, such as Bitcoin Unlimited. For miners, they initially actually weren't super jazzed about Segwit. They wanted the big block sizes. And there was this interesting New York agreement, which was basically a coalition of 50 or so companies that all wanted these bigger blocks. But then you had economic nodes. So for example, an exchange like Bitfinex, who listed futures markets for these forks, right? Bitcoin Unlimited and Segwit 2x. And end users basically bet against those forks. So this was a really nice, real example, kind of putting these ideas to the test in an economic way. And so these economic nodes then said, whoa, okay, there's a lot of backlash coming. People do not like these forks. And so that was part of what then pushed back against this New York agreement. And again, investors kind of selling futures for these proposed forks indicated that clear market preference of not changing these consensus rules in a more significant way. So it provides a really interesting and instructive case study. And what I think is also interesting is how power varies across that process between these different groups. So for example, as you can see in this kind of just directional diagram here, during the protocol ideation and implementation phase, you're going to have a lot of influence from certainly media influencers, protocol developers, definitely some contributions from application developers who might be, wanting this. Relatively low influence from miners and investors just yet. But then over time, as you get merged into core and the signaling time frame starts, then miners start getting a lot more influence and power. And then subsequent to that, once the signaling threshold is hit and a particular change is getting locked in, that's when the economic nodes have a ton of power to say, whoa, no, we're not, we either don't want this or we do. And then ultimately investors can weigh in as well through their economic actions. But super interesting. And so if you're kind of thinking about a lot of this and you're looking at some of the protocol upgrade proposals that are out there, a natural follow-up question is like, well, how do I measure the degree of consensus that a particular upgrade has reached? And there's no magic formula for that. It's very messy, very kind of iterative, chaotic process. But what Lynn and the group outlined, I think, is a helpful framework for just thinking through some of the different metrics across these stakeholder groups, different announcements from these groups, the price of Bitcoin or potentially competing forks depending on the stage of that upgrade, miner signaling process, what are protocol developers saying about it, et cetera, et cetera. So what are some risks and trade-offs when we think about upgrades to Bitcoin in general? Well, we talked a little bit about one of those earlier in the video, this idea of like big money coming in and being able to maybe influence development of an alternative client that has certain features. But as we discussed, there's a counter argument around like, well, big money probably wants stability. They just want number go up. And so maybe they're in favor of ossification. If we really wear our tinfoil hat, maybe there's actually state actors at play that wants ossification of Bitcoin, right? Are there people in our community that are advocating against any change who are paid government actors? Again, tinfoil hat time, but I think it's an interesting question to ask because the very ideal environment for governments realizing they can't ban Bitcoin, right? That ship has sailed. You can't shut it off. You can't turn it off. You can't ban it. So what do you ideally want? You ideally want to at least control how people use it. And so you want to prevent Bitcoin from changing to be able to accommodate billions of people in a self-custodial peer-to-peer fashion. And you want people to just go through the custodians because you can manage those custodians. What you can't manage and enforce are millions and even billions of people all around the world. Interesting to think about, right? Lynn and the group go through a number of different risks associated with alternative clients. Not to say that that's bad and that we all must sort of bow down to Bitcoin Core and that one and only one reference implementation is the holy gospel. But there are a number of risks. They talk about something called bounty claims. And so there are a variety of situations in which alternative clients are introduced that can lead to network fragility, chain splits, etc. Another really interesting perspective that I think makes its way into this whole discussion was a recent post from James O'Byrne, who worked as a Bitcoin Core developer for many years. And he's basically laying out this consensus conundrum. Bitcoin faces a one-of-a-kind leadership problem. So the TLDR of this is he's basically characterizing pre-Taproot Bitcoin's consensus as being more or less a, quote, benevolent dictatorship, right? Where you just kind of, you had Satoshi, then Gavin, then, blah, 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 who were kind of getting necessary changes through that ultimately were good for Bitcoin. But he's basically asserting that you now have a relative power vacuum. You kind of no longer have this benevolent dictatorship or oligarchy or whatever we want to call it. And so on the one hand, he's kind of arguing that you need this leadership hierarchy to be able to like get important changes through if we want Bitcoin to reach its potential. Maybe we don't. Like maybe we're fine with a fraction of the world using Bitcoin in a peer-to-peer fashion, but that feels against the ethos. But what's also against the ethos is the very notion of this kind of hierarchical leadership type of role. There are some notable rebuttals of this claim and characterization, notably from Midnight here, who basically just says, look, like that characterization of benevolent dictatorship is totally wrong. And in fact, it's dangerous that you would even kind of articulate it as such. So how do we go forward? Do we sort of like trudge along with all this unending debate around these different proposals until we reach a kind of crisis level need for change and then we jam stuff through? Will it happen more methodically and organically? It will be very interesting to see, but my whole takeaway from this entire video is to hopefully inspire and encourage you to pay attention to some of these things, right? Not all of us have time to muck through all the details of these different proposals. That is part of why I do this channel, is to hopefully distill some of that, make it a little more accessible. Again, if you're not subscribed, be sure you are, because there are a number of proposals that are in the very late stages of discussion and debate. And so I think as a Bitcoin user, it is important for you to be able to know what is happening and know what's going on. And to also, through this nice framework that Lynn and the team have outlined, know where and how and when you can exert your influence in being a self-sovereign citizen of Bitcoin. This is also yet more reason to take self-custody of your Bitcoin, right? Because those who are holding Bitcoin only through a custodian are going to be able to react far less nimbly to different changes than those who are holding their own keys. I have a whole playlist, by the way, if you're newer to Bitcoin, on how to take self-custody, all the security best practices. Additionally, this is hopefully inspiration for why you might want to run your own Bitcoin node. Gives you more agency in terms of how you can participate and how you can, in a very explicit way, maybe reject changes that you don't want. Again, I have a whole playlist on how to run a node. Why might you want to do that? Building a node from scratch, using a more plug and play. There are lots of options, and I outlined some of those options in a video I did earlier this year. And lastly, for those of you that really do want to kind of get your hands on some of this stuff and look into this in more detail, you can always take a look right on GitHub. All the BIPs, all the Bitcoin improvement proposals are going to be outlined. You can see them, read a sort of abstract of them. X, Twitter is a great place to stay kind of in the loop on different things. Nostr increasingly is a good way to stay on top of things as well. But coming back to this ultimate question of, is there a looming Bitcoin consensus crisis? I don't think I see one as of yet, but what I will say is, coming back to this theme of Bitcoin's inevitability, number go up is one thing, but enabling Bitcoin's full potential as a peer-to-peer, self-sovereign monetary system, I think is another thing entirely. And for the latter to reach billions of people, make no mistake, change to Bitcoin's rules has to happen. There are many clever things that people are doing. ZK rollups on Bitcoin that are not purely trustless, but that, use some sort of optimistic assumption, side chains, right? All of these things are not fully trustless. So I sympathize with the ossification case, but I think it is a little misguided if our goal is peer-to-peer money. But no doubt the debate will continue to rage. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think of any of these topics? Let me know in the comments down below. But I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath this video. That really does help get this to a broader audience. And I think this is a super important topic that a lot more people need to be aware of. We want to move people out of that apathetic and unaware bucket into at least having a perspective on some of these things. And if you're so enamored with this content, you want to donate to a pleb, which really does help me continue to make these videos, you can do so in a number of ways. There's a YouTube Super Thanks feature built directly into YouTube, or my preference, you can zip some sats my way on the Lightning Network to my Lightning address, ragermajor@getalby.com. And for those of you that want to get in touch with me, I'm now working with a number of clients one-on-one, helping them with taking self-custody, creating a multi-sig, running a Bitcoin node, privacy best practices, and more. You can reach out to me at vita.io/IanMajor. But for now, we'll go ahead and leave things here. As a reminder, my friends, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you then.